I'm deaf, and by age 5, I wasn't too concerned about it. I had a father who was hard of hearing, and I had 8 brothers and sisters who thought nothing of it. If I started to feel sorry for myself and cause a scene, they'd remind me of the fact that being deaf was no big deal, since father was the same way. So growing up, I wasn't obsessed with my deafness. But one exception to this was my mother, who always felt bad that she had a deaf son. She was always coming up with different schemes to make me hearing. Once, she took me to an Indian reservation where this Indian tribe lived. The medicine men formed a circle around me and started dancing and chanting and stomping their feet. They put snake oil in my ear and continued dancing in a circle. I understood absolutely nothing of what was going on, of course, and it didn't improve my hearing at all. Next, my decided to take me to a chiropractor. For a full year, I put up with being wrenched and twisted like an old rag doll. That didn't improve my hearing either. Then my mother tried to think of something else. She remembered my aunt and uncle lived in Los Angeles, California, and had joined a big church. Previously, my aunt had tried to convince my mother that if she brought me to L.A., the whole congregation would pray for me, and I would be cured. Mother fell for that, and so we went to Los Angeles. The Sunday we were there, we went to the church with my aunt and uncle. It was huge and filled to the brim. I sat the whole service, not understanding a thing, and the next morning, on Monday, my aunt brought me back to this church. She pointed to a room and told me to go in. So by myself, this little deaf went into a room filled with hearing adults, still not understanding word one. Then all at once, this man who had been sitting quietly started going into convulsions and leaped up and landed on the floor and was writhing around. I asked someone, "What's wrong with him?" And this man next to me to explain that he was filled with the Holy Spirit. And that's what happens when you're talking with God. And I thought to myself, boy, that must hurt. That scared me so much that the next morning, on Monday, I made up my mind not to go into the church again. But I let my aunt and uncle dress me for church, and my aunt took me down and dropped me off. But no way would I make myself go into that building. So I started off to wander the streets of Los Angeles. Well, days turned into weeks and weeks into months. And of course, I realized that my aunt and uncle must know I wasn't going to church, but they never said anything. And at age 8, I just continued my forays throughout the entire city. I remember one time I noticed a junk dealer. He had a horse and buggy, and he would go through the alleyways and pick up junk, put it in his buggy. I asked a friend of mine why. He told me to sell it, of course. I thought I was so fortunate to have stumbled upon this. So I got up early the next day and went through the alley myself, finding things. I found wire, bottles, and the like in trash cans. I had my collection waiting for him when the junk dealer came. I sold it to him and earned 25 cents. I was so thrilled. I had money of my own. I started working really hard, gathering old newspapers or anything I could find and selling them. I was earning a salary of my own. So I bought a red wagon next and was able to load more onto that. So I started to work even harder, wheeling and dealing my own little bits. But every day it would end up that I would be a little further away from home. Many days I would arrive home really tired. Sometimes on the way home, if I came across, I would climb in my wagon and just shoot down the hill through traffic and everything. That was really stupid of me. All the way I'd be praying that no one would hit me or be in an accident. Many times I had many close calls, but that's how I do it. Just get in the wagon and go for it. I learned about many things in Los Angeles that summer. I learned how to be honest and how to ask. I remember one of my friends taught me how to sneak under this woman's fence into her yard to steal figs from this tree she had. I thought it was wonderful. I loved figs. I would crawl under the fence and grab those figs and take off. This became a daily habit, sneaking in and taking off. But one time, when I was up in the tree plucking away, I felt this hand grab my shoulder. around, and there was this woman glaring down at me. "Why are you stealing figs?" she demanded. Of course, I could read her lips, but I thought I would lie and pretend not to understand her. I said, "I'm deaf," and she said, "Oh, you poor baby, poor little boy," until she regained her senses. I said, "Why are you stealing my figs?" I explained, "I'm hungry." "Well," she said, "why didn't you ask?" And that's when I learned the meaning of the word ask. "You mean asked you would have given me some?" She said, "Of course. I've got lots of figs. Why in the world would I tell you no?" And that's how I learned to be honest and learn to ask. I also learned about people in LA. Many times after walking all day, I find myself far away from home and suddenly realize I was lost. I'd ask people where I was or show them a paper with my address. Some people were very nice and explained to me how to get home. Others would put me in their car, drive me home. Once in a while, a man would try to tell me where I was, but after 2 or 3 tries, would just give up and tell me to go away and not bother him anymore. Everyone was a little bit different, and that taught me a lot. That also taught me how not to be afraid. When I was lost, I could always find some help. I also learned how not to let bullies threaten me, or even to be afraid of them. One time when I was out working and had a whole pocket full of money and was feeling pleased with myself for having made so much, this gang of boys started following me. I could sense them behind me yelling insults as I walked along, and I knew very well what they were doing, because they knew that I couldn't. One day, they finally blocked the path. They started up again with their jibes and mockery, and I didn't know what to do until I saw one boy who was clearly the leader, and all of a sudden it came to me what I had to do. I looked him straight in the eye and started screaming as I ran up to him and hit him right in the nose. He took a dive. I won, and in an instant I knew that I could handle this kind of situation. It turned out that the natural for these boys to choose a leader was more or less survival of the fittest, and so I became theirs. It didn't matter in the least that I was deaf. No, that's how my first sign language class started, with that group of boys. I also set up my first deaf awareness program, them. I taught them sign language, explained to them about deafness and how frustrating it was, and so on. And 2 of them are still my good friends. One is a lawyer in Los Angeles, and the other is a doctor in Seattle. We're still in touch with each other and exchange Christmas cards each year. So remember that I learned hypocrisy and about how two-faced people can be. At the end of that summer, the church had a big revival. Now, they knew that I hadn't been going to church all that summer. Everyone knew that, but they decided they wanted to show me and the Lord off by claiming that he had saved my hearing. They taught me how to stand up in front of people and say, into the mic, "Praise the Lord, I can hear better than I did." So I got up there in front of what must have been 5,000 people, all watching me. The place was packed, and as I reached the podium, I looked around and then said, "Praise the Lord, I can hear better than I did." The people went nuts, jumping up and down and screaming. I was still standing there puzzled when this woman preacher came up to me with tears running down her cheeks and pulled me into her arms. I had trouble breathing, so I pushed her away. And I know that I must have helped them raise maybe $100,000 or more that day. Such hypocrisy. But that's life, and I learned about people in the process. Now, I hope that all of you young boys and girls can learn what I learned when I was young. Dare to be different.
One of my teachers at the Kansas School for the Deaf, Mr. Edward Boltz, graduated from Gallaudet in 1915. He was my math teacher, as well as the boys. One day he went to the drugstore, and the manager told him that one of his boys had come in and written a note which said, "I want Sunday," spelled S-U-Y. He asked Mr. Foltz what he thought this meant. After puzzling over this for a minute, Mr. Foltz said, "Oh, I get it. What he meant was that he had come in from an ice cream sundae." Foltz, his name sign is an F like this on the arm, realized how atrocious the boy was. From that point on, while conducting class, he would glance around the room while the students were chatting, interrupt them and say, "Spell the English word for that sign." One of the students said that they felt sick to their stomach. "Oh, you have a crazy stomach," he replied, spelling out crazy and stomach. "What is the English word for this sign? 5 fingers down?" He realized that the students couldn't spell the words for what they signed, so he decided to do an exercise in the classroom. Whenever we had 5 or 10 minutes before dismissal, he would bang on his desk and ask us to pay attention. He would say spelling, 10. We knew 10 meant to number our paper from 1 to 10. "Now, spell this." And we said, "That's an easy one, Jim." "No, the entire word. Gymnasium." Then he said to spell the following word, the hint being that it means exercise but begins with a C. We looked around at each other, mulling it over, and then came up with the word calisthenics. He would do several words like this. One activity which I really liked was when he would strike a pose such as stand with his hands on his hips to come up with the English vocabulary word that described what he was doing. Bewildered, we looked down at our arms and then spelled arms akimbo. We had spelling often, which some of the boys and girls didn't like, but found that it did teach us to spell correctly. Now, I wonder why schools for the deaf don't set up spelling bees. What do you think about having spelling bees in school? My experiences in high school. I was raised in Mobile, Alabama, where I attended public high school. At that time, around 1963, there were no interpreting services in my school. I became very frustrated having to depend on many of my hearing friends for information to what was going on in class. One day I was so frustrated and fed up that I told my mother that I didn't want to go to that school anymore, but wanted to transfer to the Alabama School for the Deaf. Finally, my sister, who was also deaf, and I made the transfer. When we got there, we really felt awkward because neither of us knew sign language and there were no sign language classes offered. So we picked it up from the other students. My experience at the Alabama School for the Deaf was different because we were segregated. The black and white deaf students were not allowed to associate with one another, and the quality of education was very low. My sister and I never really had to study because both of us had a strong academic background from public school, although we had missed a lot of information. In school, I had no role model. I had never heard of a successful black deaf person who had become a teacher or perhaps a principal or had a successful job. Most of the black deaf students who graduated from the Alabama School for the Deaf at that time would go on to work in a factory, a laundry, or become janitors. I realized that I didn't want this to happen to me. I was fortunate that in 1968, the Alabama School for was forced to integrate. When integration finally took place, it was another new experience in that the quality of education was greatly improved. I learned so much. It felt like a different world. I learned about Gallaudet, which up until that time I'd never heard of. I remember asking some deaf white teachers if blacks could attend Gallaudet, and the teachers said that of course they could. I remember showing me the Tower Clock yearbook and being astonished to see that there were African students there. I was told that of course I could go there, but I replied, no way, that I was too dumb. I thought that all black deaf students were dumb just like me. No, my teacher said, if you study hard, you can. But how can I improve my English skills, I asked. And my teacher said, by reading. Read, read, read. But I said that reading was boring, but she said that it was the only way I could improve my academic skills. So I did just that and read constantly. Then my teacher asked me what I wanted to become in the future. After thinking about it, I replied, maybe a teacher or a counselor. I wanted to help other deaf children. That teacher encouraged me. Actually, by that time, I had several deaf white role models. She encouraged me to study hard in order to pass the Gallaudet entrance exam. I had set my goal and succeeded in passing the exam. When I entered Gallaudet, I was amazed to see so many African, Oriental, Russian, and German students. I was so excited my first year at Gallaudet that I wrote home often telling my mother about the various experiences I was having. Of the 5 years at Gallaudet, the best was when I became Miss Gallaudet in 1976. I felt that was my greatest accomplishment at Gallaudet. Then, when my sister and I graduated from Gallaudet in 1977, I had to decide what else I wanted to do. I set myself another goal and decided to enter graduate school. I decided I wanted to become a counselor rather than a teacher. I went to graduate school and graduated in 1979. Then I applied for a job at MSSD. I worked there for years as a dorm counselor. Last fall, I became a school counselor there. I feel as though I have accomplished a lot, but I'm not finished with my goals. Each time I attain one goal, I set another. Now my next goal is to get my PhD one day. I believe that you can succeed if you set your mind on something and strive to reach that goal. After a year of touring the world, disputing the oral method, and explaining the value of total communication, I reached my final destination, Nigeria. As I looked back, I wondered if it was worth my time, energy, strength, and health, and whether I had accomplished what I had set out to do. I would say that I did because many of the countries expressed their appreciation of my efforts and grasped the meaning and importance of total communication. While talking with the deaf principal of a school there, Gabby Adepju, I was asked if I would be writing about my travels. I said that I was keeping a diary of my year abroad and sending excerpts back to Gallaudet, which would be held, in hopes that someday I might write a book. He insisted that I make a strong statement, something that would have impact upon the reader. Because many people aren't willing to read an entire book, he suggested that I make it concise and powerful. It was 12 o'clock that night when I went to bed. I tossed and turned until about 1, when I woke up and began to compose a ballad. Before I knew it, it was almost 5 o'clock in the morning. I could barely keep my eyes open, so I put it aside and went to sleep. Only 10 minutes had passed when Gabby's wife, Grace, bustled in looking sweet, with her hair braided in the typical African style. She had come to wake me and tell me that I had another town to go to. "I just went to sleep," I told her. "You mean you didn't sleep well?" she asked. I said that I had, then pulled out my ballad and began to read it over. It was pretty strong. I then showed it to several people who felt that it was interesting but too long. So I condensed it to about 1/5 of the original length. Now I will sign the first small portion of it. Bells, 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 bells. Who can hear the bells? The hearing, the hard of hearing, the partially hearing. I am deaf, profoundly and congenitally deaf, born deaf, stubborn, and free. I was born to a hearing mother and a hearing father, but they granted me the greatest gift ever bestowed: love, pride, and independence. I was their beautiful mistake. Happiness came first. Education came next. Speech came last. My mother and father could hear, and they heard the pleas of the deaf. Bells, 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 bells. They gave me a bell of confidence, a bell of happiness, a bell of harmony, a bell of hope. Through heavenly communication of God-given and God-sent dancing hands and prancing fingers. Bells, 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 bells. Who can hear the bells?